All right, folks, in this lesson, I'm going to talk to you about something that's going to be really important for your development career as a programmer, and that's how to work with source control. And specifically in this lesson, I'm going to be talking about Git. Git is the technology that supports source control. So let's go ahead to the whiteboard and take a little look at how Git works, and then we'll motivate it a little bit for why you want source control. So let's say I'm doing some programming, and I'm going to start writing some file from scratch here. I'm going to spend hours and hours and hours and hours writing my code here. And all of a sudden, I accidentally hit the wrong key. And I decide to exit. And I try to open up my code again in my code editor, and everything's gone. So this is one thing that source control can help us do. It can help us from losing our changes by creating timestamps of our program. And even better, if we want to go back to a version that was previously working, we can do so. You can think of source control as other things like if you use Google Drive, iCloud, Dropbox, or other technologies that save your work. The difference is with Git is that we're going to be telling when to save the work. So I'll look at the manual page here, and you'll go ahead and see that it has some information here. The name is kind of silly here, I suppose, but what's important is the description here, that it's a fast, scalable, and the key is it's a distributed revision control system. And Git works primarily on the command line, or at least that's what most users will be doing. There are other tools that integrate with Git well, but I'm going to be teaching you how to use Git on the command line. So to summarize a little bit of the motivation with Git, it allows us to save our work, allows us to revert to previous versions. It's distributed, and we'll see why that's important in a moment. But basically that means that we're able to distribute or work on our repository with friends or on different machines. And overall, it's a rich tool set, primarily for programmers. Okay, so it's going to be worth us learning. Now, one of the things that Git is not GitHub. And that's something important to keep in mind. So Git itself is, well, a content tracker or a source control system, and GitHub is a web host. And this is the technology or the tool. Okay, so that's one thing to keep in mind. But let's go ahead and take a look at GitHub right now. So this time, go ahead and navigate to github.com. You'll notice that it has some information about what GitHub is. And basically, it's the largest, most advanced development platform in the world. Well, at least in their terms. And there are other web tools where you can store your source code. Tools like Bitbucket or GitLab, for instance, are other popular ones at this time. So what you should do if you haven't used GitHub yet is go ahead and sign up for GitHub. And I'm going to show you how to clone a repository from scratch on github.com and work with it in whatever environment you are, wherever you are in the world or whatever machine you're working on. So let's go ahead and create our first repository here. You can go to github.com/new, or when you launch into GitHub, you'll likely have a green button that says New Repository. And let's go ahead and just create a repository. And I'm just going to call this tutorial. And you'll see likely whatever your GitHub username is, and /tutorial is what the repository name is going to be. You can give a description, and you can make it public or private. In this case, I'll just make it public so you can see it after if you want. I'll add a README file, and that's all for now. So let's go ahead and create the repository. So here you'll see where it exists, and it'll be your username / whatever the repository is. And the word repository means where your code is going to be put. It's a repository or a collection of information. So all we have in our repository right now is this README file, and it says tutorial. Now, if I want, I can edit the files here on github.com and it provides some interface to do that, but we're really interested in using our own code editors and tools in our desktop environments. So let's go ahead and clone this repository and start learning about how GitHub works. So how am I going to use git clone? Well, I'm going to click on this green button, and it gives me this URL to GitHub repository. That is, this is telling us these files that exist here that are on the README, for example, as part of our repository, or any other files we create, they all live in this location. So I want to copy this location here. And what we're going to find out is this is really just a collection of files or a little file system that we're downloading. And that's what Git built on top of. So let's go ahead and do that. And for this, I'm going to leave the screen and bring up a terminal window. Now I'm going to be doing this in the terminal because it's really the best way to get the most out of Git here. And I'll make the font nice and big for you, and I'm going to center it on the screen here. So recall we hit the green button to get our tutorial here, repository, and we're going to proceed forward from there. Okay, so what we're going to do is type in git clone, and then you can right click and do paste or Control-Shift-V, and we will obtain the repository. So at this point, it's going to say cloning into tutorial. This is the new directory that it's creating. So if I do an ls here, I should find my tutorial directory, and here it is. So again, I can do ls and see if that tutorial directory is here. And indeed it is. And if I look at its contents, there's a README here. So let's cd into that directory. And let's do an ls again. So here we see our README file. If I do cat and print it out, you'll notice that it matches the README contents. Let me do it again here. It looks a little bit different. There's a hashtag and then a tutorial. That's because this is the format here. If I edit this file, the hashtag tutorial turns into this format here. Okay, great. So let's go ahead and make a modification on our local machine. So recall that this repository now lives on our desktop environment. So if I open up this folder, for instance, I can see the README file. It's in my home directory in the tutorial folder here. And that's pretty cool. So when we've cloned a repository, what that means is we have downloaded from github.com our repository that's hosted onto our local machine. And we're going to use the technology called Git to issue commands to communicate files back and forth. We'll talk a little bit more about this, but let's go ahead and just do our first upload to Git here. So let's go ahead and make a change to our README file. I'm going to go ahead and say, my name is Mike. And I'm using the Vim text editor here. So I'll hit escape and save it with WQ here to write to the file. And any text editor would be fine to make edits here, but that's just a quick one. So if I write out the contents of the file, notice that my name is Mike is part of this file, but that's not reflected on github.com, even if I refresh the page. Okay, so since we've made a change here to our local file that we want to reflect on github.com, we have to capture a snapshot of our local repository and then push those changes to the web. So how we do this is we issue a command called git add, which says, I want to track the local files here, that's in this directory, and specifically readme.md, and I want to then add that to this next snapshot that I'm going to create. So then I can type in git commit a message with -m and a helpful message, added my name. And then we're going to notice here, this is our comment here. This is our snapshot. This is what our code looks like in our current environment here on my desktop. And what we're going to push to our repository and ultimately on github.com is this change where we've made one file change, that was to our README file, and how many insertions or deletions we've made. And in this sense, 3 insertions would be the sort of my name is Mike, however it's computing that. That's the change that we've made to the file. So I'm going to type in git push. It's going to ask me for my username and my GitHub password. And oops, I've got to make sure I type it in correctly. And it won't echo back to you, meaning it won't write out the contents of your password because that's just a security, so you can't see it. Okay, so now we'll see that we've made some change here. And it said it wrote those 3 new changes, and we have our main branch of code here. And we'll talk, we can talk about branches at another time, but it has pushed the changes here. So now if I refresh this page, we'll now see the change reflected in my name is Mike. Okay, so let's back up for a second because we can see how there are changes here. And now if I go ahead and clone this repository, whether it's a friend or myself on another machine, they'll get this repository of code with our updated files, with whatever they see here on github.com. But let's go ahead to the whiteboard and talk a little bit more about how this is working. Okay, so on our whiteboard, we've talked a little bit about the advantages of Git and why we used it. That's this whole section over here that we talked about. But let's talk about what's actually going on with these commands. Git add, git commit, git push. What's really going on here? So I'm going to go ahead and move this out of the way and increase our whiteboard. So what's happening is we have our working directory. And this is on our desktop, working directory. And this is our machine. So I'll just put in parentheses here, our machine. And this is our local environment. It's local because it's, well, right in front of us. We are typing on this machine as we speak. So we might have some files, for instance, like the README file. And we've made some changes to it. So readme.md file. And when we're ready, remember that this file is just on our local machine. So within this working directory, we want to make some changes. Now, since we've cloned into this directory, there's something I actually have to show you. So let me bring in the terminal our directory here. That was the tutorial. And if I do an ls and I type in .git, the files that typically start with a dot here are hidden from us. But if I do ls.git, you'll notice there's a bunch of information here because this is a Git repository. And I can type the command tree just to give a little bit of a preview of this. Tree and then branches, for instance, or tree.git/branches. And we might see something in this folder. In this case, nothing. But let's go ahead and just do the ls.git and then slash, and then all of these different pieces of information here. So we have something called hooks and logs and refs and objects. But the secret is that this is really managing our GitHub repository here. And whenever I issue a git command like git add or git commit or git push, it's modifying this hidden file structure from us. That's keeping track of, well, the different snapshots of our program. Okay, so that's just a little bit of what's going on. But one of the things that it's bookkeeping, and I'll return to our drawing here, is when we do git add, and I'll put a little arrow here, git add, it's adding files that we've changed to what is called the staging area. So this is called the staging area. And basically, it's keeping track of the different changes that we've made, those insertions and deletions. Okay? All you really need to know right now is that you've changed the file. But it is keeping track of that for you and what part of the file that it's actually changed. And then when we do the git commit portion, that's the part that's actually making a snapshot. And I'll just label it as a snapshot. That's saying at this place and time, when I do the commit of this directory, here's what it looks like. It has the README file and it has these changes. So that's effectively saving the state of your repository every time you do a commit. So you can think of git add and git commit as your two key commands. Do the git add, and then you'll do the git commit. So git add and git commit. But that's not enough, though, to push the changes to github.com. So that's where the last command comes in. And I'll just post an arrow here and type in git push. And that's what puts it into the, well, I'm just going to draw a giant cloud here, github.com. So that's going to push all of your changes, all of your data here. So here's a bunch of your data, the different changes, some more changes. Maybe you've changed multiple files, etc. And they're all going to go onto github.com and reflect on your cloud environment where this GitHub repository is also hosted. So this is what we mean when GitHub is distributed. You can have it in your local environment and you can have it elsewhere, whether that's another local environment or some host like github.com, somewhere else in the world. Okay, so that's what's going on. Now, let's go ahead and take a look at a few more handy GitHub things. So let's go ahead and open up our terminal here. And one thing that I can do is I can check on the status of my repository. So if I say git status, it's going to say our branch main, because we can have different branches. And this is one of the powers of GitHub, but we're not going to talk about it in the tutorial for today. But the idea is we have a main branch where we're working on. So if I'm just one person, I'm just working on this branch here. But let's go ahead and make a change to our file here. Our README. My name is Mike. I am making changes. And I'm going to go ahead and save these changes. And then do git status again. So this time you'll see, it might be a little bit too big. If I run git status, it'll say, okay, our branch is up to date, but we've made some changes. Okay, it detected that what was previously in our repository or our working directory, we've modified a file here, README. So what we need to do is get ready to add that file if we're going to save this snapshot here with our changes. So I'm going to add the README here. And then I'm going to check git status and see that now we have changes ready to be committed. It's in green. So we've acknowledged that we want to add this change that we've made to this file to our next commit, or that next sort of save or snapshot of our repository. So let's go ahead and do that. So I'll do git commit and a message, and I try to type something helpful. Added more to my README. Okay, and then I'll do git status again. And it'll say, okay, this branch that I'm working on, or in other words, my local directory here, because if I look at this file here, my name is Mike, I'm making changes, is ahead of my other working directory by one commit, because I've made one commit. So I need to use git push to publish my local commits that are on my local machine to the cloud or github.com. Okay, so I'll go ahead and do git push, enter my credentials, and then if I do git status here, again, it'll say, okay, everything looks good, nothing to commit, and my working directory is clean, no changes to make. And I can once again bring in my browser here. I'll refresh this page, and you'll see I am making changes. Okay, so that's your basics for getting started. Now, there's a few things to observe here as well. One thing that you might want to do is revert your changes. So there's a couple ways you can do this. You can type in git log here, and it will actually keep track of a log of all of your changes. Our initial commit, when we added my name, and when we made that last change here, added more to my README. And there's specific commands you can use for this, like git checkout. And we can then type in a specific file, for instance, like README. And let's go ahead and see what this does here. So let's try it out. So we have my tutorial, my name is Mike, I'm making changes. So if I type in git status, nothing's changed, but let's go ahead and change this file. And let's say I do something very bad. I just delete all of it, and then I save it. And then I say, oh no, I lost all my work, but I want to go back to my previous session. So this is where I can use the git checkout command and type in README, and it'll restore the last version of that file. So now if I look at README, you'll notice magically I have my work back here. So that's one way to go back in time and save your changes. And then retrieve your changes if you make a mistake. So that's really one of the powers of Git. Something other folks like to do if they're not feeling comfortable with using some of those commands is just to go ahead on github.com. You can click on one of these messages here, and you'll see what the last changes you were that you made. Or you can also go back here and you can check out your history of commits, all of your 3 snapshots in your project. So if I click on this, I can see what I did each time, and it'll show me on the right side the changes that I added, and on the left side the older version. So in this way I can look at all of my different versions here. And that's kind of a nice interface. There's other ways, of course, to do this in the command line terminal, using things like git log or git log. If I'm not completely remembering what it is, I can type git help and then log, and it'll tell me lots of different commands that I can try. I think there's a fun one here. I'm going to try to look up where I can put everything on one line here. Let's see if I can find it. One line. And I'll try to search through this here. But you can find lots of handy or useful things like this on github.com or Stack Overflow. So here's an example where you can just print out all the logs on the terminal in just one line here. So that's pretty useful. And if you ever have trouble with any of the commands, like add, you just type git help and then the command. And that'll give you the help documentation page so that you can follow along. Okay, so the last tool that I'll show you is a tool called gitk. And you may or may not have it, but if you run it inside of a directory where you have your GitHub repository, which tutorial is, then it will bring up a graphical interface of your code. So you might have to install this tool, and it's easily installable on Linux. It'll tell you on the terminal what command to write if you don't have it, but this can also show you the different commands that you have to type in. Okay, so with that said, I'm going to go ahead and exit the terminal and just wrap us up here with what we've learned. So we've learned a little bit about the motivation for using Git. It's a source control system. It can keep track of multiple versions of our code. It allows us to save snapshots of what our projects look like. And then we can use them on the web. We can distribute them to friends or access that same code repository on multiple machines. And then we've looked at on the terminal how to save our changes and push those to the web. So git add tells us, hey, we want to get ready to stage this file or get ready to put it in this snapshot. Git commit does the actual commit. And then git push pushes that whole history online so that we can distribute those changes to anywhere we are working. All right, so there's a lot more to learn with Git, but we've touched on a lot of the basics that'll get you started with your journey learning Git.